What happens when two bass road warriors spend quality time talking music and life with one of their peers? Bassist, educator, author David C. Gross and bassist and head honcho of KnowYourBassPlayer.com, Tom Semioli, trade dates with the legends of rock, jazz, funk, blues, folk, country, and more. Notes from an artist. Revealing conversations with the legends who've created the soundtrack of our lives. What happens? You're about to find out. It's another episode of Notes from an Artist.
So before we get started with the show, I want to have a little shout out to my former brother-in-law, Ian McDonald, may he rest in peace. Well, I met Ian in the late 70s. We recorded together. We ended up having a band together. And I ended up marrying his wife's sister, as with most first marriages. That one didn't last. But my admiration and the knowledge I learned from Ian through sitting on mix sessions and how he composed, and what a brilliant musician. And all I want to say is, Ian, rest in peace. We're going to play a tune, Tomorrow's People, off the only solo album by McDonald and Giles. So Ian, my hat's off to you, and I'll see you someday.
David, what can we say about Tony Levin that hasn't been said? Well, maybe a lot of things haven't been said about Tony Levin because many people don't recognize that name, but they will certainly recognize his work. Among the records and the people he has collaborated with. Hold on to your hats, folks. Carly Simon, Buddy Rich, Alice Cooper, Brian Ferry, Chuck Mangione, Paul Simon, Ringo Starr, Joan Armatrading, and who he's most noted for, Peter Gabriel, a longtime member of King Crimson, and John and Yoko when they did the comeback record Double Fantasy in 1980. He also has 7 albums under his own name, several collaborative albums with the Stickmen and other configurations. And David, not only is he probably one of the masters of our instrument, the electric bass, he's also a web pioneer. Tony Levin was among the first bloggers. As a matter of fact, when he started his papabear.com, there wasn't even a word called blogger. And papabear.com still exists. It is now an archival site. And if you are interested in the history of rock and roll as it relates to progressive rock and jazz, go to papabear.com and visit TonyLevin.com as well to keep up with what Tony is doing. And David, you call him the Jack LaLanne of rock and roll.
Yes, indeed. When you really think about it, he's been going strong for over 40, 45 years, and it's constant, incredible music, whether he's reading a jingle date or playing with the Crimsons. And so I asked him, how do you stay fit? And so now we call him the Jack LaLanne of elder statesman touring musician.
Indeed.
And I don't think anyone's ever called him that. And I figure I'll get a phone call from him telling me, don't call me that ever again. However, one other thing. This man, besides being a great musician and a great guy, is so humble, so much on a quest for more knowledge and new musical experiences. I salute him. I think it's just great.
Yes, he is. And it's very refreshing to hear somebody say, I don't know, when he doesn't know the answer to a question. And we asked him about his past and, of course, his present and what he hopes to do in the future. And Tony is still moving forward. My gosh, David, he's played on over 500 LPs. He also helped establish the Chapman Stick as an instrument. And we learned from Tony one of the reasons he came up with many of these great bass parts on the Peter Gabriel and King Crimson albums is because he started off on the Chapman Stick. And then, of course, he played your beloved Funk Fingers, which we get into.
That's true. That's true.
Yes. And one of the things we love about Tony, and you'll see in this interview, you will hear in this interview, is it's all about the big M. It's all about music with Tony Levin.
And believe it or not, we were able to fit 19 songs, everything from Perry Como to Peter Gabriel. I mean, come on, folks. Where do you hear that kind of music? You got it. Notes from an artist. So why don't we start the interview? How about that?
All right. Here is Tony Levin. Hey, Tony. Good to see you, sir.
Thank you. Hello. Gentlemen. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome, sir. And look at all those collection of basses. David, in honor of Tony Levin, my doppelganger, I'm going to remove my hat for this interview.
All right. That's a look.
I just want to say...
I was going to shave, but I said it would probably never grow back. So
now you see, I'm often mistaken for Tony Levin. And I tell you, it's a great thing because I get great seats at restaurants. It's a great pickup line in singles bars. It's just when I start playing bass that they know I'm not Tony Levin.
Very funny. And I used to get mistaken for G. Gordon Liddy.
You know what? I actually can see that. That's very funny.
For those of a certain age. But I was there first, but then he got that look. Yeah. He shaved his hair.
Anyway, David, not only were we talking to a bass player, a bass brethren of ours, but we're talking to a web pioneer. And I remember back in the 90s, David, when you were a young man, there was this website called Papa Bear. And this was before there was a term internet, right, Tony? or blog?
Blog. There was certainly an internet way before that.
Internet.
Yeah, in the mid 90s, the people were starting to be able to start their own website, and I quickly found that people who came to my website were not interested in buying my CD by mail, by sending in a check and things like that. What they were interested in is more of my stories from on the road and photos from on the road. So why not? I started doing that. And a few years later, the term blog came up.
Yeah, no, I would imagine, musicians, obviously we have lots of downtime on the road, and there's obviously some journalists lurking in you. What inspired you to create this blog?
I don't know. Good question. I think it's because nobody wanted to hear, the people who, in those days, the website had an email. They could see even my address. And so they would write me, more of those stories. And so I do feel, I would say anybody like me who's done shows their whole life does feel a connection with the audience and the fans, but also any audience. And there's a necessary barrier between the performing band and the audience, something of a barrier. And the web, especially in the early days, I recognized that the web took down some of that wall. Suddenly they're emailing me for sure, but also I'm putting up pictures, and I quickly found that what people love seeing is pictures of themselves, pictures of the audience. So I started habitually after the show, at least after the show, if not during it, I'd catch a picture of the audience, put it up on the website, and people, even if it's a small crowd in a club, people who were aware of that website really liked seeing that.
And what's interesting now with David is that the website is archived. I mean, it's still up there, but it really gives young folks and people who are just interested in digital technology what a website looked like in 1996. I remember seeing your blog in 1996 and going, wow, there's pictures on it, and Tony's telling stories. It's like, Can I throw it a number 220? 220 pixels wide was the biggest you could put up picture. So that's like this. And consequently, unfortunately, all of my archiving wasn't so good then. And so all the pictures I saved on floppy disks. Yes. Are 220 pixels wide. So when I put out a book of my photos through the years, but I couldn't use any of those because they were right. But it was just, again, this was the first time in history that we had a fly on the wall view of, you're working with John Lennon, King Crimson, Robert Fripp, and all the recording sessions we did, because we had to depend on these things called magazines, David, these long pieces of paper with a staple in the middle, and maybe once every 2 years, they'd interview Tony Levin. So we didn't know. We had this daily communique. David, can I read you from the scripture of Papa Bear?
I think that's a good idea. It's a good starting point, actually.
It's a religious experience. In the beginning, there was bass. It was Fender, probably a Precision, but it could have been a Jazz. Nobody knows. Anyway, it was definitely very old, so it was probably CBS. And God looked down upon it and saw that it was good. And he said it was very good. In fact, he couldn't be improved on at all, although men would later try. And you know that from all your boutique basses, David. And then he created a man to play the bass. But more and more as time passed, having little else to do, the man came to practice upon the bass. And the man became to have a great set of chops. And he did play faster and faster until the notes rippled like a breeze through the heaven. And God heard this, and he became bugged. And he spoke to the man, and he said, listen, man, if I wanted Jimi Hendrix, I would have created the guitar, which is another story later. So there you go. From the scripture of Papa Bear.
That's it. This is your life, Tony Levin. That's it.
Well, it's on the internet. It's got to be true.
Yeah, I hadn't revisited that little writing thing in quite a while. Thanks for reminding me about it.
Yeah. We read that.
I'm going to show you something. The last time we met was when I was doing a Trey article in Basics magazine, and you handed these to me, and they still work. Nice thing about wood.
Yes, you haven't worn them out. I see that.
No.
They're your bamboo shoots. But Tony, you started on the upright at 10 years old. You were drawn to classical music. Tell us what drew you to the bass fiddle.
Well, thanks for being so knowledgeable about me. Sometimes it's good to have a reminder to myself. Yes, I did start in classical. I was pretty obsessed with classical. Nothing wrong with that. And I went to Eastman School of Music in Rochester, New York, and studied classical. And it happened that at that school was a drummer named Steve Gadd, who played both classical and jazz and a little rock in those days. And Steve had nobody to do gigs with. So I just being the only bass player in the school who wanted to do gigs, I kind of got an education without having aimed. I got a second education without having aimed at that. And I found that I kind of liked being the only bass player instead of one of 8 in an orchestra. Yeah. I kind of liked this being the only guy. And gradually, Steve and I both branched off into rock after we were out of school.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Now, with David and I always talk about the benefits of having a music education. Okay, and now we know in the YouTube world, you can learn how to play bass on a YouTube channel by studying music formally. My argument for it is that when you hear a piece of music and you like it, you can analyze it, understand it, and incorporate it into your own style. Okay, now I might not be able to play a Tony Levin King Crimson line, but I can listen to it and say, well, listen to the way he voice leads. That's why this line, this passage sounds so good. How did you balance that? Because in a rock world, you're more about coming up with part as opposed to reading notation. So how did you make that transition?
Interesting subject and an interesting larger subject. Let me kind of veer off it a little bit. What I feel is, having played classical and jazz and rock, classical players, the wonderful thing about classical musicians is the reverence for the best of the best music. Mm-hmm. I'll say we, even though I'm not one of them anymore. Yeah, we just so obsess on that even, let's say, the Beethoven symphonies, even like the second, he was even Beethoven is not good enough to live up to our standards. And only the best conductors playing with the best, conducting the best orchestras have come up with a definitive recording. Okay, so that's classical. You could call it snobbish, and that's the downside of it.
Yeah.
When a conductor comes in and wants to do something modern, and then the whole orchestra is like, oh, geez, let's do Beethoven's third again. Okay, so I tried to take that from classical, that appreciation of Hendrix, but of what's really real classic and special about it. And then I started playing jazz, and jazz players have what we call big ears. Jazz players listen and hear, in my opinion, in general, more in a more sophisticated way than classical players. So they know what's going on, and there are you guys know this, and most of our watchers know this. There's interplay and little jokes and references going on with the jazz players that doesn't exist in classical, for sure, and not so much in rock. So that's a great thing that I try to keep from jazz when I moved into rock. And rock has this respect, and a wonderful thing of rock is the power of the music. Never mind the sophistication of classical, never mind the sophistication of jazz and the ears and all the subtleties and stuff. Never mind that. There's the power. I love that, and I try to, obviously, in King Crimson we have a bit of that, and so to me there's great things about each of those genres. There's also a little bit not so great things about the genre itself, but a player can overcome that. That's not your question, but it was something I felt worth saying.
But it actually veers into my question, which was, we interviewed Trey a couple weeks back. Oh, yeah, really. And a good guy, too.
Absolutely.
So we're talking about transcription books that he's been doing. And it brings to mind the question, did you have charts, or was everything sort of played and played and played again in terms of working with Fripp?
You're talking about King Crimson.
Yes.
There were never charts, but I always, because I can, actually every player I've run into has his own way of making a chart. It might not be writing out all the notes, or it might be. So the other guys was different in different eras of the band, but generally I was the only one who would be writing out a chart of some sorts. Sometimes the very notes, it varies even with one piece. Just for fun, I once collected all of the versions I had of one piece. And the first one was 6 pages long and had most of the notes written out, 6 pages out. And then I would find a name like the Fairy Fingers section. Usually Robert Fripp would name this, and I would remember then, okay, once I've memorized that, okay, it just says Fairy Fingers, and then it says Fairy Fingers in G, and then it says Fairy Fingers reversed, upside down, and things like that. So I didn't have to write. It's because I knew eventually I'm going to play this live, and I don't really want to have 6 pages and have my head buried in them. So the process, writing a chart is one thing, and for me it helps me learn a piece, but it detracts from my memorizing the piece. So gradually, in King Crimson, the process where there's a lot of rehearsing, I gradually pare down my chart to be only 1 page, or hopefully eventually no pages.
Ron Carter just did a book called Chartography. It's basically 6 versions of Autumn Leaves.
Autumn Leaves, yeah.
And all from live albums. So actually, it might be interesting for you to revisit maybe one tune that you have a half a dozen versions of and maybe see the truth. So basically what he did is 1 in 60, 65, 66, 67, and see how they grew and see how his very, very interesting way of going.
That was King Crimson, live in Montreal at the Spectrum 1984, doing Lark's Tongue in Aspic, Part 2. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
First time I heard you and Gad, a friend of mine who was working at SIR brought home a copy of Margie Joseph.
Wow, that goes back a ways.
It really does. There was some great stuff back.
That would have been an LP. There were no CDs then.
That's right.
Yes, that vinyl thing that was black with a circle inside it.
You mean one of these things?
Wow.
Look at
that. Was Margie Joseph doing I Can't Move No Mountains. I think it was 1973, featuring our guest, Tony Levin, on bass. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
On the topic of albums, since David brought it up, it's a thing we ask all our interviewees. In the year 2022, is the album format to you still relevant? I mean, when I think of all the records you did, whether it's Gabriel, Crimson, or The Roar of 74, one of my favorite Buddy Rich records.
That was Buddy Rich, Kilimanjaro Cookout, featuring Tony Levin, our guest. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
I think of them in terms of albums and whole piece of music. But now with streaming and Spotify and YouTube, is the album still mean something now?
I'm going to bow out as a non-expert. There are many things I'm a non-expert at, and I try to recognize when I'm asked about them. So I'm really, like a lot of guys, I'm involved in making the music. There's my recording setup back there, and I play every day on people's records, on people's releases, and I don't even ask them, is this going to be an album or a CD or just Spotify? So I don't know. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm willing to learn. If you want to explain it, you want to explain the way it's going.
To me, as a baby boom, I still gravitate towards the album. I like to hear a whole piece of music. But then, of course, Spotify does a great job of algorithms based on what I play on Spotify, and it's mostly my old record, and curating new and old music. So there are advantages to it. There are bands, some of Trey Gunn's work I would have never known was out there unless Spotify sent me an algorithm. So there is that. But then there is the losing the album experience. If the only Tony Levin track I heard was, something from Carly Simon record you did, well, I think, that's what he does.
Add to that, how many people think, when you think about it, how many people know Elephant Tongue, but they have absolutely no idea what else is on the album, which I think is a tragedy in itself. They go to the recognizable tunes, dare I say, almost hit-like. And I think that has a lot of issues with streaming.
Good point.
There you have it. Elephant Talk. King Crimson. This is Notes from an Artist. CygnusRadio.com.
When I go back to my generation of King Crimson, because I came along a little later than you, David, when I bought those records, Beat and things, I went backwards and explored King Crimson as an album artist. Whereas if it was just one track, like you said, so I would have thought, okay, King Crimson was just Elephant Talk and nothing more. But
good stuff.
Well, let's go back though.
I'm learning.
Let's talk about that YouTube shtick. So in a nutshell, what concerns me about learning on YouTube, to a certain extent, I mean, there are some people that actually get into the theory and the other things, that you will learn that song. You'll go to a gig or a jam session and play that song, but all of a sudden the singer says, can you do that step up? And this person has only learned it in that one position. So there are issues with that as well. So I'm finding YouTube to be a blessing and a curse for education in music.
Wow, interesting.
I think Tony's interviewing us. Tony, when you broke into
the Tony Levin show,
he should.
And how do you feel about that?
Tony, when you broke into studio work in 1970 or thereabouts, what was expected of a studio musician in that era?
Wow, good question. First of all, I was lucky. I happened to move to New York when there was not a shortage of bassists, but you just could be in town, play with a few guys around, and suddenly they said, can you play a jingle tomorrow morning? Can you play a little record session tomorrow? It was so different than it became in later years. One can't apply what I felt about it to the way it's been ever since. It was pretty great. This has just popped into my mind. Every studio had a bass amp, an Ampeg B15. It had a lock on it. There was a thing called the bass amp club that the bass players had contributed to, maybe regularly, I don't really know. That was kind of at an end when I came to New York, and they had the key to open the amp. Otherwise, you had no amp. DI, you could go, but the engineer was sitting there and wanted the amp. So by the time I came, the bass players had left them unlocked, of course. And I was saying, well, A, where would I call to pay to use this bass amp? And B, why should I do that? So in a way, I'm not proud of this. I was one of the first bass players doing studio work to not pay for the bass amp that was sitting in the studio, that did not belong to the studio. That was one of the many very quirky things about recording in the 70s. I'll tell you something else. All of the engineers, without exception, wanted a Fender Precision. Reluctantly, if you had a jazz bass, they could live with that. And the engineers had a lot to say about, as much as the producer to say about whether this bass player, whether you should call him back. Just by blind luck, I happened to have a Fender Precision, a very nice one, the only electric bass I had. So I came in and did a session or two. Engineer said, great, love your sound. There was no variation of sound. There wasn't a Tony Levin sound. It was a Fender Precision with the treble bass, the one knob turned all the way up. That's boom. Right. So great, fine with me. I had to practice playing with a click. I was very good at playing with a metronome, but playing with a click track, which was standard, kind of still is, but was standard and was very unusual to a classical player. I spent a night or two. I had a friend who was an engineer, Dixon Van Winkle, great engineer at A&R Studio. He said, you want to be able to play with the click, so come in tonight at 11 when all the sessions are done, and I'll just play you a few tempos and you just play along with them. That helped me for when the pressure was on and I was doing some session that I wouldn't be drifting from the click. You asked what it was like. It was easy to get work. The music wasn't so great. I was, if I look back, I haven't looked back at it until just now, but if I look back, I think I was not being what you would call an artist. I was being a sort of the craft of playing, showing up and playing the right notes, which were written out. Usually the arranger had written out the notes, certainly in a jingle, they had written them out. And gradually over that first year, I learned, if it was a record session, I learned a hard lesson for me, easy lesson for most people, that the arranger doesn't want the notes he wrote. He wants the part he imagined. And that the appropriate thing is to change the notes to make the part as good as it could be. Believe it or not, I had a hard time with that. Why? Because I was a classical musician, and classical musicians play what's on the page. And if it's the wrong note, and you know it's the wrong note before you even play it, it's a C chord and there's this B, you play the B. You're a classical guy because you're a jerk. You play the B and then you say, and then you have to get permission from the conductor to change the B. Oh, well, there was a mistake. The copyist made a mistake. So I was that guy. Not for too long. I'll give myself a little credit. I thought, okay, I kind of can hear he wants this kind of groove. I'll just change the notes, and the arrangers were, that's what I want.
That was Paul Simon doing 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover. We sometimes said it was 50 Ways to Love Your Liver, but that's a whole nother story. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
Gradually, I got once in a while the chance to play on an album with some latitude in the music, not a disco record, but something. And gradually, I got kind of connected with some producers who wanted that, who wanted me to play my parts, and kind of one look back at the way it was doing sessions.
Following your career, yes, you had to be a technician. You had to come in and do the part and get in and out because you were recording on tape. You didn't want to wear out the tape, and certainly you were being paid by the hour.
Yeah, as an example, a Perry Como record with a background singers, Perry in a little booth with his cardigan sweater, like he's supposed to have, and strings and horns. They don't want the bass player saying, excuse me, I made a mistake. Can we, so it wasn't high pressure, but it was like the guy's got to do it. You got to do it right. And you can't be ahead of the beat or behind the beat or anything like that.
That was The Way We Were, sung by Perry Como. 1974 in the RCA studios in New York. This is Notes from an Artist, CygnusRadio.com.
You brought something interesting up in terms of the written part versus what they imagined. As time went on, and I'm thinking Harold Wheeler as a prime example, who wrote musical bass lines. But you're right, before that, it was a lot of, here's what it is, this is what I want. So yeah.
Maybe not. I mean, James Jamerson and Carol Kay were at that time and before that making up classic great parts that made the piece a hit. But the bulk of things, first of all, half of what I did was jingles. So it was a 1 minute thing. It wasn't about finding a group. And the others, they had an arranger to make up to be the Carol Kay, to be the James Jamerson. And so there wasn't that latitude. And the bulk of records, when you think of records being made in those years, the bulk of them were not looking to the rhythm section to give the basis. This was not Motown records. This was New York City studio sessions. And that's the way it was. I was very lucky once in a while to find myself on a session that was not like that. And frankly, I wasn't too good at it, especially at first. I think I once did a James Brown session James not there, but I didn't even know how to play short bass notes. All my notes were long. It must have been a disaster. I don't know what happened. They must have just replaced me afterwards. I hadn't heard his stuff that much. It was hard to believe.
That was James Brown doing Super Bad, Super Slick, 1975. This is Notes from an Artist, CygnusRadio.com.
What point in your career did producers start hiring you to be you?
I didn't really keep track. But a date that has come up over and over again to me was in 1976 in July, when Bob Ezrin, the producer, called me to go to Toronto to play with this guy I hadn't heard of, Peter Gabriel, who had just left the band Genesis. And how fortunate am I that I said, yeah, I'll go up. That I didn't say, I have a jingle that day. I mean, I wasn't just, by that point, I had played with Bob on a few Alice Cooper records.
Right.
And Lou Reed's Berlin, a little bit on that.
That was Lou Reed doing The Kids, and before that, Welcome to My Nightmare by Alice Cooper. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
That day, I went up to Canada and I met Peter Gabriel and I met Robert Fripp. That's in 76. And I'm still today making music with both of them. I have been very inspired musically by both of them and others too. That's the kind of the way, one of the things about music and the way it goes is you maybe do something even you didn't think was a good idea to do it. And you meet some drummer, Steve Gadd's on the session, and then you get to do this whole other career you never imagined. The music and the musicians can lead you in direction.
That was Peter Gabriel doing Salisbury Hill from the first Peter Gabriel record. And I must tell you, in 1976, I had just joined Aztec Two-Step, and whenever we would tour, I would make certain that cassette was in the dashboard as we traveled. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
In fact, to this day, when I say no, when I sometimes say no to a project, I think twice. I think, could there be some opportunity here for something I don't understand and I haven't been exposed to? Because that has happened in my career. And in others.
Yeah, sure. You talk about pressure. When the red light goes on, you have to deliver. And of course, you were working with marquee names, Alice Cooper and Lou Reed, to some extent, marquee names. Now, you did do a Ringo album, I think, in 77 or thereabouts. But of course, you did John Lennon's big comeback record. From all the interviews I've seen with you, his directive to you was, I hear you good, but just play as few notes as possible. When you're in a situation like that, I mean, the eyes of the world are on you. And David, we had spoken to Gary Van Syop, who played with John sometime in New York, early 70s, when he was doing, the protests and things like that. But you played with him when, obviously, after his retirement. Was there a lot of pressure on you to deliver there? Or was it just comfortable sessions? Because, again, Peter Gabriel's a marquee name, Alice Cooper, et cetera, Buddy Rich. But we're talking John Lennon. I don't think it gets much bigger than that in the rock world.
Good question. No pressure. There was a lot to those sessions, but not pressure was not part of it. Partly the way I am, maybe some of the other guys were this way. I don't really ask even why they asked me to be there. I just kind of show up and listen to the music. And then I kind of get really into trying to get the best bass part for that music. So John said to me, they tell me you're good, just don't play too much. And I don't worry, I won't. I knew I wouldn't overplay on this stuff. And I listened and played the bass, and it was a pleasure. And I think I can say that the other guys felt the same. It was not a pressure thing at all.
That was Beautiful Boy by John Lennon. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
However, around the same era, I did the Buddy Rich live album that I got to play on, and being in Buddy's band is nothing but pressure, no matter how long you're in it. And then if you can imagine, not in the band, just, I'm a New York studio cat. We don't have a bass player. He quit. So you got to do it. So that was some high pressure of the kind that I could handle because I was that kind of player. And then Ringo's session, really different than most that I've done, because it really was, it wasn't pressure, but it was, it wasn't great. Ringo didn't feel good about us New York studio musicians. And why should he? Why should he be doing an album with all guys he never saw, including Steve Gadd playing drums along with Ringo? All which musically is an okay thing, but he was put in, I didn't do it, but he was put in a position that made him uncomfortable, and he communicated that pretty well to us. So it wasn't a failure of a record, but it was, you don't want to be on an album. Well, you don't know what to do when you're on an album and the artist is unhappy with you just because she doesn't know you.
That was Drowning in the Sea of Love, Ringo Starr. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
A lot of sessions through the years and all kinds of situations. That's actually the only time that particular situation came up, and I felt bad about it, but I didn't know anything I could do about it. Maybe somebody different than me could have spoken the right words to Ringo to make him feel cool, but I'm just not that wise a person.
Whenever you called on a high-profile session, whether it's Bowie, Lennon, Brian Ferry, Paul Simon, etc., do you ever research what other bass players did or their previous catalog, or do you like to go in fresh?
None of those. I don't research it. Maybe I should, and it's not because I like to go in fresh. It's just because I'm an idiot. I just show up. In fact, the first time I played on a few albums with David Bowie, and the first time was near here. I'm in Kingston, New York, and near here is a studio outside of Woodstock on a mountain, kind of little place at the top of a mountain. And I showed up and had never been there, even though it's in my area. And I knocked on one door, and David Bowie in his underwear opened it. It wasn't the studio. It was the artist's place to stay. And he said, "Who the hell are you?" Or something like that. "Who are you?" I said, "Play bass on the session." So that was my introduction to David.
That was David Bowie doing Slip Away with our very special guest, Tony Levin, on fretless bass. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
No pressure there. Not at all. Yeah, I forgot where I was at.
Well, we're just talking about the fact that, when you work with someone, obviously you were Peter at the beginning of his solo career, but if you go back and listen to their previous work and kind of get a feel for what they've done.
I wasn't aware of Genesis. I became plenty aware of them afterwards. And I don't mind that. It was fine. And with King Crimson, I hadn't heard King Crimson when I joined King Crimson. In fact, at what was really my audition, but I didn't know it was my audition. I thought it was us just getting together to form a new band, maybe. And but they were checking me out. They showed me Red, the piece Red, that I had never heard. And in those days, I was very quick at picking stuff up. I was young and all the brain cells were working. So I just kind of, in a couple of minutes, I was playing Red and they were going, "Yeah, this guy's okay. He learned this." And I wasn't playing it like the original because I hadn't heard the original, but I learned the chord.
That was Red, King Crimson Live in Toronto, 2015. This is Notes from an Artist on CygnusRadio.com.
Were those auditions in Hell's Kitchen, New York, or thereabouts?
Yeah, I only did the one, but yeah, it was.
Okay, because we know two bass players that auditioned that didn't get the gig. One was Kenny Aronson, and one was Donnie Nassau. And they said they had the same...
I don't mean to be rude. I'm only laughing because I didn't know I was being auditioned. I didn't know anyone else. I didn't know that was going on.
Right, because Robert had moved to New York City, I guess, with punk rock and all these things happening. He wanted to see what was going on. And he auditioned, he auditioned Donnie and Kenny as we know them. And I think he said the same story. He showed them Red and then he played it double time. And that was the end of their audition.
Famously, the guys in the band later told me that Jeff Berlin also auditioned.
Okay, right. I think Jeff may have told us that too.
Yeah. So of all of those, the only one who didn't know who he was auditioning was me. and by the way, it wasn't to be hey, King Crimson needs a bass player. It was to form a new band.
Okay.
We called it Discipline for the first 9 months or so. Eventually, somebody got the idea of changing the name to King Crimson. Yeah,
it's a little bit more recognizable brand in the business of music.
Yeah, Robert didn't want to have, King Crimson, we're going to do this. He didn't want to do it. He wanted to form a new band. And then after we wrote the music, and which was the Discipline album, he said, "This is worthy of being King Crimson." I can't put words in Robert's mouth, but something like, "This is worthy of being King Crimson."
You were at SIR for that time, right, Tony?
I don't remember that, but it could be.
For rehearsals, because if I recall, I was playing with Ian McDonald at that time.
Wow.
And we were in one room and you guys were in another room. And you must have been in the band at that time because that's like 78, right? And I remember it was the first time that Robert and Ian had spoken since...
You got to write a book. That was not me. I was invited in 1981.
Okay, all right.
So or 81.
Right, that was the tour with the Orange Vests, I remember, you guys, with Peter Gabriel.
With Peter Gabriel?
Yeah.
Could be.
Yeah, it could be. And Tony, now from the upright bass to the Fender Precision, your beloved Fender Precision, to the Chapman Stick. How did you make that left turn? There it is.
In about 1975, Emma Chapman had invented it and released it. And I started hearing about it from other musicians. The reason I heard about it, it's funny to think back, is I used to play tap style on the bass. Not so much on records, once in a while on a record, but kind of obnoxiously practicing between takes in the studio. It's something I don't do anymore. I outgrew being obnoxious, at least in that way. And so I would tap stuff. And actually, it was the drummer, Donald McDonald, who showed me that idea. And so the guys who knew my playing, maybe 3 or 4 of them within 1 month said, "Have you heard there's an instrument that's designed to be played by tap, touch style?" And I said, "No, and it's not a bass. I'm not interested." And they said, "Oh, no, it is. It's a bass and a guitar together on one fretboard. So the next time I was in Los Angeles, I just bought one, and I was not among the first to get it. There was at that time a band called Kitty Hawk, which was two stick players, maybe three.
Yeah.
So I was an early player of the Chapman Stick.
Yeah.
And I found it very useful. At that time, I was playing in King Crimson and about to play with Peter. Sorry, I was not playing in King Crimson. I was about to do Peter Gabriel's first album. So I'm incorrect. Anyway, subsequently, I found it very useful playing progressive music because the bass side of the stick has a lot of attack and it's kind of a different thing to it. But the strings are in fifths and backwards compared to a bass. So it helped me come up with different ideas. Same old 4 strings that my fingers just play the riffs. So it was very useful when in the profession of trying to come up with parts that are valid and really good for the music, but are different than what I used.
Soup. That was the Stickmen with Tony Levin, song called Soup. This is Notes from an Artist on cygnusradio.com.
And you also used it appropriately. First thing that comes to my mind is I love it when I call you names from Joan Armatrading's recording. That first track where you hear that boom, 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 boom. And
that was Joan Armatrading. I love it when you call me names. Great stick work by Mr. Tony Levin, our guest. This is Notes from an Artist on cygnusradio.com.
It would not have worked on a bass guitar. Do you know what I mean?
Sure.
There you go.
I don't logically figure those things out, but I think like a typical bass player, like all of us bass players, I have somewhere in some part of my brain the sounds that I know I can get on various instruments, or even on the one instrument, the thumb, the dampen where I play on it. And then I hear the music that's presented to me. If it's Joan Armatrading, I'm a lucky guy because she's great and all her songs are great. Yeah. And I think, I don't think, actually, it's just that sound starts humming itself in my ear. And then I put some notes to it. And then I reach for that instrument. And maybe it doesn't work, but if it works, then if that process is that's not Zen-like, but it's really different than thinking, well, I have the funk fingers and I really would like to play them on this record, or I have this riff I've worked out, maybe it would work on it. It's really different than that. It's just surrendering to the music, letting myself hopefully help the music be better.
Well, I'll tell you, the combination of you and Eric Dolphy on bass clarinet gave me the idea to get my first 6-string bass, believe it or not.
Wow.
Because the low B stuff, I tap as well and do things on that and not have to learn to play cello.
ARP, let's talk ARP. Been around since the earth was still cooling, according to your Web thing. With age comes wisdom. It's interesting that you would think as a young person, you would never be playing music after you turned 50, 60, and yet you're still going strong and you're still finding new challenges. What keeps you going?
Good question, I guess, but I haven't really thought about an alternative. Hadn't occurred to me. And when I was young, I didn't think about it. In a different field than music, that question, it really can be gone into deeply. Most of the musicians I know, like me, we just play. There are other issues as one gets older. Mostly about traveling, health and traveling become more of an issue. Playing, I don't want to go into whether I play as well as I did. It's different than when I was younger, but anyway, I can play and I can travel, and I'm lucky to be healthy enough to tour and to do what I most love to do, which is play good music in front of an audience. To interpret the question, why should I look at my age and say, well, should I still be doing this? It's still what I want to do. And it probably will always be what I want to do if I'm able to do it. In a way, very lucky people like me who knew at a young age what they wanted to do. And I didn't have a plan like, okay, I'll have bass gurus interviewing me on Zoom. I didn't think of that. I just thought I'll play the bass and I'll play good music and maybe that would be great. And I'm exactly the same now as when I was 10 years old. Wow, chance to play good music, I'll do it. And sometimes I even get paid for it, which is great.
To go a little further into this, when you are on the road, do you go to a gym? Do you have a home workout? How do you stay fit?
I try to stay fit for sure. Hotel gyms. I walk a lot. It depends on the band. There are really, we could do a whole hour on the difference between touring with Peter Gabriel at King Crimson and staying in very nice hotels with OK gyms, or touring with Stickman or Tony Levin Band or Pete or Levin Brothers Jazz Band, where 8 a.m. we're driving the van to the next gig and the hotel doesn't even have a gym. And there's no time to take a walk. But yeah, I try. And I do work out in the hotel room. It crossed my mind to do a YouTube thing about older person hotel workout. And then I thought, why? I'm not good at this. It's just what I do. I'd be better off watching.
Even better, though.
I should watch that YouTube, not create it. But But it's a valid thing that I try, like I think most of the guys doing what I do, because it's important to keep your health, and it's a little bit more complex as you get older. Everybody knows that.
Yeah, sure. Do you found a greater appreciation in your senior years, given all that's gone on with COVID, that you're still be able to get out there and play?
Absolutely. I'm really lucky with COVID. Appreciation in senior years. I don't want this be all about senior years, but I'm 75. And at 75, people's lives can get better in their 70s and 80s if they're lucky enough to be healthy. Because a day that's just, it might sound jive saying this, but a day that you kind of feel okay and you can go for the walk and there's no aches and pains and stuff is a really good day. Whereas 20 years ago, that day would be like, yeah, well, it hasn't started. What am I going to do? Because as you get older, a little, you twist your ankle in an airport or something, instead of the next day forgetting about it, 2-3 weeks later, you're still limping a little. The things take longer to get over. So the days, maybe rare days, or maybe often the days where you're okay. I remember my mother, when she was elderly, if she could take a walk, even with the stroller.
A walker.
Thank you. Duh. I'm almost there. She'd say, this is a good day. And I understand that now. I can do a lot more than she was doing then, but I'm not 90 yet. So lucky to be playing music at any age.
Yeah. And your career as a band leader and a recording artist, World Diary, Waters of Eden. Now, you work with some great band leaders. How are you in the studio? As a band leader, do you select musicians to follow your directive, or you just want them to bring what they have to the table?
I don't think of myself as a band leader, but I certainly...
You are.
I guess very busy doing stickman tracks. We're overdue for an album, and we have a tour coming up in April, and trying to finish an album remotely. What I've learned as a player, of course, is to get good players. And if they have good players, to let them decide what to play. That's what I like when somebody hires me. And when I send a track to Pat Mastelotto, it does not have a drum machine loop on it. Generally, I won't even try playing with one, because it will. But if I do, for some reason or other, need that, I certainly won't send it to the drummer. Because the drummer will say, oh, gosh, another guy who heard a drum machine part. And is he going to ask me? He'll say that. But also, for me, there's a thing called demo love, where you get used to hearing the same thing. And I'm just human. The more times I hear that drum part that I'm not going to hear because I'm not going to do it, that drum machine part, the more I get used to it, and the harder it becomes for me to accept, well, Pat Mastelotto, he's playing at a different time signature. It's just a whole different thing. So now, if I just send him my part and he does that, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's great. But otherwise, there'd be a little bit of, well, and I don't ever want to be the guy to say, Pat, what I had in mind is the backbeat here, because I know how he would feel, and I know that I chose him to be in Stickmen because he's him.
That was Scarlet Wheel by the Stickmen, live at the Bearsville Theater in Woodstock, New York. This is Notes from an Artist, CygnusRadio.com.
I think the most valuable thing as a band leader of Robert Fripp, actually, maybe I didn't exactly learn it from him, but when you think about it, Robert Fripp, what a brilliant guy he is, and writer and guitar player, but he carefully chooses the musicians for each incarnation of King Crimson who are going to push the music in the direction that he feels it should go, because he's not going to tell everybody the parts. Sometimes he suggests stuff, and more than that, he suggests by smiling or not smiling, but pretty rare throughout my 40 years in the band that he's said, I'd like you to play this. Get the right musicians and then let them be themselves, and take a deep breath and accept that, and remind yourself that you chose them.
Well, that's kind of the way Miles put together his great bands, and even Bowie. All the musicians we've talked to that were in Miles' band, Benny Rydfeld, we talked to him, Harvey Brooks, and they said the same thing, that Miles really chose them because he wanted them to go in this direction, and he curated his own bands. And you're right, there are so many different versions of King Crimson. Well, Tony, great talking to you.
This is your life, Tony Levin, that's for sure.
I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you guys, and I appreciate the intelligence of your questions and the bass-centricness of it all.
Tony, we'll see you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Wasn't that fantastic? I want to thank our guest, Tony Levin, and of course, my partner in crime, Tom Semioli, for another fabulous and informative interview. I would encourage all of you to be on the lookout for the new Stickmen recording, and I would also encourage you, if you have missed any of our previous shows or want to listen again, we invite you to our podcast, also titled Notes from an Artist, which you can find on all major podcast players or at notesfromanartist.buzzsprout.com. This is David Gross for Tom Semioli and Tony Levin. Thanks for listening, and we will see you with a new episode next week. Have a great week, folks.